Welcome back to True Crime Trolls, where we venture into the most haunting and unsettling true crime stories from around the world. Today, we're lacing up our boots and hitting the trails. Only these paths lead to terror. We're delving into the tragic cases of hikers who set out for adventure but never made it back home. These serene landscapes turned deadly when killers stalked the very trails meant for escape and peace. Before we dive into these chilling stories, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a dark and twisted tale like this. Marissa Daniels was a mother of 5, living in a quiet suburb of Frederick, Maryland. Her life revolved around her children, 2 boys and 3 girls, ranging in age from 2 to 12. Marissa was a devoted mother, juggling the chaos of family life with remarkable grace. Her days were filled with school drop-offs, after-school activities, homework help, and bedtime stories. Despite the daily hustle, she always found time for herself, often taking early morning hikes to clear her mind and connect with nature. These hikes were Marissa's sanctuary. The rolling hills and wooded trails of nearby Cunningham Falls State Park offered her a place of solitude, a respite from the demands of motherhood. She was a regular on the trails, known to locals and park rangers as the woman with the infectious smile and boundless energy. But as Marissa went about her daily routine, a sinister presence lurked in the shadows, one that would shatter the tranquility of her life and the lives of her 5 children. Unknown to Marissa, she had caught the attention of a disturbed man named Lucas Grayson. Lucas was a drifter, a man with a troubled past and a growing obsession. He had been watching Marissa for weeks, carefully studying her routines, following her from a distance as she went about her daily life. He was drawn to her beauty, her warmth, and the sense of purpose she exuded, a stark contrast to his own empty existence. Lucas had a history of mental illness, and over the years, his grip on reality had loosened. His obsession with Marissa grew with each passing day, feeding into his delusions. He convinced himself that they were meant to be together, that Marissa needed him in her life. In his twisted mind, her daily hikes were a sign, a private ritual meant to draw him closer. As Marissa continued her hikes, unaware of the danger that was following her, Lucas began to formulate a plan. He believed that if he could just confront her, she would understand, that she would see the connection he felt between them. But as his obsession deepened, so did his paranoia and anger. He began to see Marissa's lack of acknowledgement as a rejection, and that rejection festered into a dark, violent desire. On a crisp autumn morning in late October, Marissa set out on what would be her final hike. The trees were ablaze with the colors of fall, the air cool and invigorating. It was a perfect morning, the kind that Marissa cherished. She had dropped the kids off at school, packed a small lunch, and headed out to her favorite trail in Cunningham Falls State Park. Lucas was already there, lurking in the shadows, watching as Marissa parked her car and began her ascent up the familiar trail. He had been planning this moment for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to confront her. As she walked, Lucas followed at a distance, his heart pounding with anticipation. The trail was unusually quiet that morning, with few hikers around. Marissa, lost in her thoughts, didn't notice the figure that trailed her, always staying just out of sight. As she reached a secluded area near the summit, Lucas made his move. He approached her from behind, his footsteps silent on the soft earth. When Marissa finally noticed him, it was too late. Lucas grabbed her, pulling her off the trail and into the dense woods. Marissa struggled, her screams muffled by the hand Lucas clamped over her mouth. In those terrifying moments, Marissa fought with every ounce of strength she had, but Lucas was too strong, too driven by his twisted obsession. In the end, Lucas's obsession turned deadly. He overpowered Marissa, his rage and delusion driving him to commit an unspeakable act. There, in the heart of the forest she loved so much, Marissa's life was brutally cut short. When Marissa didn't return home that afternoon, her family immediately knew something was wrong. It wasn't like her to be late, especially not without calling. Her husband, Daniel, contacted the authorities, and a search was quickly organized. Park rangers, police, and volunteers combed the trails, their hearts heavy with dread. It wasn't until the following morning that Marissa's body was found, hidden among the trees off the main trail. The news of her death sent shockwaves through the community. Marissa had been a beloved figure, a devoted mother and wife, and her brutal murder left everyone reeling. The investigation into her death was swift. Evidence found at the scene, including DNA and footprints, led police to Lucas Grayson. He was arrested at a rundown motel a few miles away from the park, where he had been hiding out, convinced that Marissa's death was a necessary act, a twisted fulfillment of the connection he believed they shared. Lucas Grayson was charged with first-degree murder, and his trial became a media sensation. The story of a mother of 5 being stalked and murdered by a disturbed stranger was too horrific to comprehend. During the trial, Lucas's mental state was a central issue, with his defense team arguing that he was not in control of his actions due to his severe mental illness. Despite these arguments, the jury found Lucas guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a small comfort to Marissa's grieving family. For Daniel and their children, life would never be the same. The loss of Marissa left a void that could never be filled. The home that was once filled with laughter and love became a place of sorrow and remembrance. Daniel did his best to care for their children, to keep Marissa's memory alive in their hearts, but the pain of her loss was a constant presence. The community rallied around the Daniels family, offering support and love during their darkest days. A memorial was established in Cunningham Falls State Park, near the trail where Marissa had taken her final hike, as a tribute to her life, and as a reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in the most peaceful places. Marissa Daniels was more than a victim. She was a loving mother, a devoted wife, and a cherished friend. Her death was a senseless act of violence that left an indelible mark on all who knew her. But in the wake of tragedy, her community came together to honor her memory, to support her family, and to ensure that her life, though cut short, would never be forgotten. For many, the Appalachian Trail, AT, is more than just a long, winding path through the wilderness. It's a spiritual journey, a place where people go to reconnect with nature, to test their limits, and to find peace. Spanning over 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine, the AT has seen countless hikers from all walks of life. Among them were Emily Rhodes and her boyfriend, Greg Larson, a young couple who had set out on the trail to escape the pressures of their everyday lives in the city. Emily and Greg were both in their late 20s, passionate about the outdoors and eager to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. They had planned their through hike for over a year, preparing meticulously for the challenges they would face along the way. Their goal was to hike the entire trail, a feat that would take them several months to complete. But for Emily, the trail was more than just a physical challenge. It was a journey of healing. She had recently lost her mother to cancer and hoped that the solitude and beauty of the wilderness would help her find peace. They began their hike in the spring, starting at Springer Mountain in Georgia. Full of excitement and anticipation, the couple quickly fell into the rhythm of trail life, making friends with other hikers, sharing stories around campfires, and immersing themselves in the stunning landscapes. They relished the simplicity of life on the trail, where their biggest concerns were the weather, the terrain, and where to find their next meal. As they made their way north, Emily kept a detailed journal of their journey. She wrote about the people they met, the challenges they faced, and the moments of quiet beauty that made the hardships worthwhile. She also wrote about her growing sense of unease, a feeling she couldn't quite shake, even in the most serene settings. Unbeknownst to Emily and Greg, they were not alone in their journey. Following them from a distance was a man who had no business being on the trail, a drifter named Richard Graves. Richard was a deeply troubled man with a history of violence and a fractured mind. He had been drifting from town to town for years, always on the move, always searching for something he couldn't quite define. He had stumbled upon the Appalachian Trail by chance, and something about it drew him in. The remoteness, the anonymity, the sense of freedom. It all appealed to him in a way that nothing else had. But Richard wasn't on the trail to find peace or clarity. His mind was a dark place, filled with rage, paranoia, and violent fantasies. When he first saw Emily and Greg, something in him snapped. He became fixated on them, seeing them as a target for his growing anger. They were happy, in love, living a life that Richard could never have. His obsession with the couple grew with each passing day, feeding his delusions and pushing him closer to the edge. Richard began to stalk them, staying just out of sight but always watching. He followed them from shelter to shelter, from campsite to campsite, waiting for the right moment to strike. Emily's unease grew as they moved further north, sensing that something was wrong, but unable to pinpoint the source of her fear. Greg tried to reassure her, chalking it up to the isolation and the inherent dangers of the trail. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something or someone was following them. By late September, Emily and Greg had made it to Pennsylvania, a notoriously rocky and challenging section of the trail. The days were growing shorter, and the nights colder as fall began to take hold. They were physically exhausted, but determined to push through the final stretch of their journey. On the evening of September 13th, they reached the lookout shelter, a small rustic structure perched on a ridge with a breathtaking view of the surrounding forest. It was a popular spot for hikers to spend the night, and Emily and Greg were relieved to find it empty when they arrived. They set up camp, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night, enjoying the peaceful solitude. But as darkness fell, the atmosphere shifted. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming in the daylight now felt oppressive, the trees closing in around them. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the shelter, and Emily's unease returned with a vengeance. As they lay in their sleeping bags, trying to get some rest, Emily thought she heard footsteps outside the shelter. She sat up, listening intently, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. Greg assured her it was just the wind, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. In the dead of night, Richard finally made his move. He approached the shelter with the stealth of a predator, his mind completely consumed by his violent urges. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and in that moment, Emily's worst fears were realized. She barely had time to react before Richard was upon them, brandishing a hunting knife he had stolen from a previous victim. The attack was swift and brutal. Greg tried to fight back, but Richard's assault was relentless, fueled by years of pent-up rage. Emily's screams echoed through the forest, but there was no one around to hear them. Richard's fury was unstoppable, and within moments, the couple lay motionless on the shelter floor, their blood staining the wooden planks. The trail that had once been their sanctuary had become their tomb. The discovery of Emily and Greg's bodies the next morning by a group of hikers sent shockwaves through the trail community and the wider world. News of the brutal double murder spread quickly, and authorities launched a massive manhunt for the killer. The AT, a place that had always been seen as a safe haven for those seeking solace in nature, was now tainted by an unimaginable horror. Richard Graves, however, had already vanished into the wilderness. He continued to evade capture, slipping through the cracks of society as he had done for years. The manhunt stretched on for weeks, with sightings reported across multiple states. But Richard remained elusive. The murders of Emily Rhodes and Greg Larson cast a long shadow over the Appalachian Trail. Hikers became more cautious, aware of the dangers that could lurk even in the most serene environments. The sense of community and trust that had always defined the trail was shaken, replaced by a lingering fear. In the years since their deaths, the story of the Appalachian Trail killer has become a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk even in the most beautiful places. The AT continues to draw hikers from around the world, many of whom are unaware of the trail's darker history. But for those who do know, the story of Emily Rhodes and Greg Larson serves as a sobering reminder of the importance of vigilance, even in the midst of nature's splendor. Mary Caldwell was a woman who lived her life with a deep love for nature. At 55, she had spent decades exploring the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Her passion for the outdoors only growing stronger with time. Her daughter, Susanna Caldwell, had inherited this love from her mother. At 27, Susanna was a passionate environmentalist, working with various nonprofits to protect the region's natural beauty. The bond between Mary and Susanna was unbreakable, forged by countless hikes through the dense forests, rugged mountains, and serene lakes of Washington state. For Mary, these hikes were not just a way to stay active. They were a spiritual journey, a time to reflect, breathe, and connect with the world around her. Susanna shared this sentiment, finding peace in the quietude of the forest, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds, and the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. Hiking together had become a cherished tradition for them, a way to escape the demands of their busy lives and spend quality time together. The two women had hiked nearly every trail in the region, but one place held a special spot in their hearts: the Pinnacle Lake Trail in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. The trail was a moderate climb, leading through lush forests and offering breathtaking views of the surrounding peaks and valleys. Pinnacle Lake itself was a pristine, mirror-like body of water, surrounded by towering evergreens and often shrouded in mist. It was a place that felt almost otherworldly, a hidden gem that few knew about. As the summer of 2024 began, Mary and Susanna decided to revisit the Pinnacle Lake Trail. It had been a few years since they had last hiked it, and both were eager to return to the tranquil spot that had brought them so much joy in the past. They planned their hike for a warm July morning, looking forward to a day of bonding and soaking in the beauty of the trail. The day of the hike dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive. Mary and Susanna packed their backpacks with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and of course their cameras to capture the stunning views they knew awaited them. They left early in the morning, hoping to beat the summer heat and enjoy the trail in the cool, early hours. As they drove to the trailhead, the conversation flowed easily between them. They talked about Susanna's work, Mary's plans for retirement, and their future hikes. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of contentment that came from being in each other's company and doing what they loved. When they arrived at the trailhead, they were pleased to see that it was relatively empty. One of the things they loved about the Pinnacle Lake Trail was its seclusion. Unlike some of the more popular trails in the area, it was often quiet, with few other hikers around. This sense of solitude only enhanced the trail's beauty, making it feel like their own private paradise. They set off on the trail, their boots crunching on the gravel as they made their way through the forest. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the path. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. As they hiked, they chatted about everything and nothing, their conversation punctuated by comfortable silences as they took in the scenery. About halfway up the trail, they reached a small clearing with a view of the surrounding mountains. They paused to take a break, sipping water and snapping photos of the breathtaking landscape. Susanna took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. This was exactly where she wanted to be, alone with her mother, surrounded by nature's beauty. But as they continued their hike, something began to feel off. The forest, which had initially felt so welcoming, now seemed to close in around them. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves grew quieter, replaced by an eerie silence. Mary noticed it too, her motherly instincts tingling with unease. She brushed it off, not wanting to worry Susanna, but a part of her. As they neared the final stretch of the trail, the air grew cooler, the trees denser. Pinnacle Lake was just ahead, and the anticipation of reaching their destination lifted their spirits. They quickened their pace, eager to see the lake once more. But as they rounded a bend in the trail, Mary suddenly stopped in her tracks. She had heard something, a rustling in the bushes just off the trail. At first, she thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too unnatural. She glanced at Susanna, who had also stopped, her eyes scanning the trees. "Did you hear that?" Susanna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mary nodded, her heart beginning to race. She listened intently, but the forest had fallen silent again, the sound gone as quickly as it had come. Trying to shake off the unease, she forced a smile and suggested they keep moving. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger as they continued. Mary couldn't shake the sense that someone or something was following them, lurking just out of sight. She didn't want to alarm Susanna, so she kept her fears to herself. But every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her pulse quicken. Finally, they reached Pinnacle Lake, its surface as smooth and reflective as they remembered. The sight of the lake momentarily eased Mary's anxiety, and she tried to focus on the beauty around them. They sat by the water's edge, enjoying a small picnic and reminiscing about their previous hikes. Susanna, ever the optimist, marveled at how lucky they were to have such a stunning place all to themselves. But the feeling of unease lingered in the back of Mary's mind, a nagging sense that something was wrong. As they packed up their things and prepared to head back down the trail, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The journey back down the trail was eerily quiet. The birds that had filled the forest with song that morning were now silent, and the wind had died down, leaving the trees still and oppressive. The sun, which had shone brightly all day, was now hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the forest in a gloomy, dim light. As they descended, Mary's sense of unease grew stronger. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following them. But the trail remained empty. Susanna, sensing her mother's discomfort, tried to reassure her. "It's probably just the wind or an animal," Susanna said, her voice calm. "We're almost back to the car. Nothing's going to happen." Mary nodded, but her anxiety refused to abate. She quickened her pace, eager to get off the trail and back to the safety of their car. But as they neared the trailhead, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of Mary's neck stood up, her instincts screaming at her to run. She grabbed Susanna's hand, pulling her along as they hurried down the final stretch. And then, just as they rounded the last bend in the trail, it happened. A figure emerged from the trees, blocking their path. He was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, with an air of menace that sent a chill down Mary's spine. He held a hunting knife in his hand, its blade glinting in the dim light. Mary's heart raced as she tried to think of what to do. She stepped in front of Susanna, instinctively shielding her daughter from the threat. "Please," Mary said, her voice trembling. "We don't want any trouble. Just let us pass." But the man didn't move. His eyes were fixed on them, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "Trail's closed," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You shouldn't have come here." Mary's mind raced as she tried to figure out how to get out of this situation. She glanced at Susanna, who was frozen in fear, her eyes wide with terror. They were trapped, with no way to escape. The man took a step closer, raising the knife. Mary's heart pounded in her chest as she realized they were in grave danger. She had to do something, anything, to protect her daughter. Without thinking, Mary lunged at the man, trying to knock the knife from his hand. But he was too quick, sidestepping her attack and slashing at her with the blade. Pain seared through Mary's side as the knife cut into her flesh, but she refused to back down. She had to give Susanna a chance to escape. "Run! Susanna!" Mary screamed, pushing her daughter away. "Run!" But Susanna couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to leave her mother behind. The man turned his attention to her, his eyes narrowing as he raised the knife again. In that moment, Mary knew she had to act fast. With the last of her strength, she tackled the man, knocking him off balance. The two of them tumbled to the ground, the knife clattering to the side. "Susanna, go!" Mary shouted, struggling to hold the man down. Susanna's legs finally obeyed her mother's desperate command. She sprinted down the trail, her heart hammering in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to flee. The world around her blurred as she ran, her focus solely on getting away. But the guilt gnawed at her. She had left her mother behind. Behind her, the sounds of struggle continued. Grunts, shouts, the sickening thud of fists against flesh. Susanna didn't dare look back. She knew if she did, she might not have the strength to keep going. Her mind raced with frantic thoughts. How far was the car? Could she reach help in time? Could she save her mother? Branches whipped against her face. The uneven trail threatened to trip her up, but she pushed forward, driven by adrenaline and fear. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees forming an oppressive tunnel. She was running blindly now, tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. The sound sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Was he following her? Had he overpowered her mother? The thought nearly made her stumble, but she forced herself to keep moving, her survival instinct stronger than ever. Finally, through the trees, she saw the glint of metal. Their car. Relief flooded her as she burst out of the forest and into the small parking area. But the parking lot was empty. There was no one else around, no other cars, no sign of help. She fumbled in her pocket for the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip them. She yanked the car door open and threw herself inside, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, she just sat there, her chest heaving, her mind a whirlwind of panic. She knew she couldn't drive away, not without her mother. Grabbing her phone, she dialed 911, her fingers trembling as she pressed the buttons. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker, calm and professional. But to Susanna, it was barely more than a distant echo. "I need help," Susanna screamed into the phone. "We're on the Pinnacle Lake Trail. There's a man. He attacked us. He—" Her voice broke, and she couldn't bring herself to say it. "Please, you have to hurry." The operator assured her that help was on the way, but Susanna's thoughts were already back on the trail, with her mother. She couldn't just sit here and wait. What if her mother needed her? What if she was still fighting for her life? She gripped the steering wheel, torn between the safety of the car and the desperate need to go back for her mother. But just as she was about to make a decision, the car door was wrenched open. Susanna screamed, dropping the phone, her body instinctively recoiling. It wasn't the man. It was her mother. Mary was covered in blood, her face pale and strained, her breathing labored. She collapsed into the passenger seat, clutching her side where the knife had slashed her. "Mom!" Susanna cried, moving to help her mother. "Drive!" Mary gasped, her voice weak but urgent. "He's coming. Just go." With shaking hands, Susanna turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she slammed her foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, speeding out of the parking lot and down the narrow road that led back to civilization. As they drove, Susanna kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man emerge from the trees, chasing them down. But there was nothing, only the winding road behind them and the dense forest on either side. Mary's breathing was shallow, her hand pressed tightly against her wound. Susanna's mind raced, trying to remember how far the nearest town was, how long it would take to get to a hospital. She could barely think straight, the adrenaline making her hands twitch on the wheel. "Stay with me, Mom," Susanna said, her voice trembling. "We're almost there. Just hang on." Mary gave a weak nod, her eyes half closed. She could feel her strength fading, the pain threatening to overwhelm her. But she wasn't going to let it win. She wasn't going to leave Susanna alone. The drive felt like an eternity, but eventually they reached the outskirts of town. Susanna drove straight to the nearest hospital, her heart pounding as she pulled up to the emergency entrance. She threw the car into park and jumped out, screaming for help. Hospital staff rushed out, and within moments, Mary was being wheeled away on a gurney, surrounded by doctors and nurses. Susanna tried to follow, but someone gently held her back, guiding her to a waiting room. She sat down, her body trembling, her mind reeling from the events of the day. She couldn't believe what had just happened. It all felt like a nightmare, something too horrific to be real. She couldn't stop thinking about the man on the trail, the way he had appeared out of nowhere, the way he had attacked them without warning. As she sat there, waiting for news of her mother, Susanna couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That man was still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for his next victim, and the thought of it sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Hours later, a doctor came to speak with Susanna. Mary had lost a lot of blood, but she had pulled through. She would need surgery to repair the damage from the knife wound, but she was stable for now. Relief washed over Susanna, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, gnawing fear. What if that man was still out there? What if he was waiting for them? Or worse, targeting someone else? She knew they had to tell the authorities everything, give them every detail to ensure he was caught before he could hurt anyone else. Susanna spoke with the police, recounting every harrowing moment of their ordeal. She described the man as best she could, his wild usses, the knife he carried, the way he had seemed to appear out of nowhere. The police assured her that they would search the area, but their words did little to ease her fears. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and restless nights filled with nightmares. Susanna stayed by her mother's side as much as she could, but she could see the toll the attack had taken on Mary. She was physically weakened, but it was the emotional scars that worried Susanna the most. Mary had always been so strong, so full of life, but now she seemed haunted, as if a part of her had been lost in those woods. The police conducted a thorough search of the Pinnacle Lake Trail and the surrounding area, but they found no trace of the man who had attacked them. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The lack of closure gnawed at Susanna, leaving her feeling helpless and afraid. How could she move on, knowing that the man who had tried to kill them was still out there? In the weeks that followed, Susanna and Mary tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the memory of that day lingered like a dark cloud over them, casting a shadow on everything they did. They had survived, but their lives had been irrevocably changed. One day, as Susanna sat by Mary's bedside, her mother reached out and took her hand. "You saved me," Mary said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Susanna squeezed her mother's hand, tears filling her eyes. "You're the one who saved me," she replied. "I don't know how you found the strength, But you did. You're the bravest person I know. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they had been through hanging heavy between them. But there was also a sense of gratitude, a realization that, despite everything, they had survived. They still had each other. As the sun set outside the hospital window, casting a warm glow over the room, Susanna made a silent vow. She would do everything in her power to ensure that the man who had attacked them was caught. She wouldn't let him get away with what he had done, not to them and not to anyone else. The trail might have taken something from them, but it hadn't taken everything. They would find a way to heal, to move forward, and to reclaim the peace that had been stolen from them, and they would do it together.